My name is Asia Starks. I'm here speaking with.
Carmen Castilla.
On January 1st, 2024, do I have permission to record this interview?
Yes.
Can you spell your name as you'd like it to appear in this project?
First name is Carmen, Carmen. I use my maiden name as a middle name, which is Gettis, Gettis. Last name Castilla, Castilla.
So, can you tell me about yourself? What makes you unique?
I don't know that I'm all that unique, but I was born and raised in Jackson, Mississippi, and remained here for most of my life. I did leave for a few years and lived in Chattanooga, Tennessee, then returned to Mississippi. I also went away to school for a little while, but I always came back to Mississippi. I did do some things, accomplish some things that were some firsts, but I don't know that I'm all that unique. I was educated in the Jackson Public Schools, and this was in the 60s up until around early 70s, and I received an excellent education.
Can you talk about your education?
I started elementary school. Well, of course, I had gone to kindergarten, but I started elementary school at Walton Elementary, which is on Bailey Avenue. And it had a good reputation at the time, and our teachers were very good. It was, of course, an all-black school. This was in the area of Jackson that is Virden Addition. At that time, Virden Addition was a community of small, mostly neat homes, and a lot of the people who lived there owned their homes. It was one of the few areas in Jackson where blacks had begun purchasing homes as early as the 1950s. Most black people in Jackson were renting from white landlords, white owners, and very few whites would sell any property to blacks. It's certainly not in a white area. So areas where there was black ownership were not that many during this time. As I was born in the 50s, I won't say the exact date, and my parents purchased the home that we lived in shortly after I was born, about a year after I was born, I think. And we lived on Revels Avenue in the heart of Virden Addition. The people up and down our street were working people. The neighbor to our left, the father worked at a meat packing plant that was considered a very good job at that time. They had a really nice car. His wife did not work. She was a full-time homemaker, and he made a decent living. There were people on the street that were house painters, bricklayers, worked in various factories, but just about everyone, it was a working class community. Just about everyone worked. Some of the women worked as cooks, some of them worked as maids, some of them were teachers, some of them were homemakers. But like I said, it was a working class community. Most of the people on our street knew each other. The houses had front porches. People would sit out on the front porch when the weather was nice, and as you passed by, you had to speak to everyone. If you didn't speak to someone, especially the older ladies who sat out on the front porches, they would call you out on it. And they'd say, "Carmen, you're not going to speak to me?" So I'd have to say, "Hi, Miss So-and-so." But of course, I usually spoke anyway. But it wasn't a bad time to grow up. We played outside in the summertime up into the night, well after dark, but we had to be at home, and so we'd play in our own yard once it was dark. But we'd play in the street. We'd play dodgeball, kickball, various things in the street, and there weren't so many cars coming up and down. So while we were in the middle of playing, someone would see a car and they'd yell, "Car!" And we'd all scatter to the side and let the car go by. And then we'd go back in the street and play some more. It was a good time. And we were somewhat insulated from the racist environment of the city and the state and the country in a way. As young children, of course, we did not understand everything that was going on. And since we lived in our own segregated community, we were not routinely exposed to some of the hardships that our parents faced when they went out to work and had to venture out into the larger world. Our world consisted mainly of our home, our friends in our neighborhood, our school, which was an all-black school, and every now and then shopping or going to the grocery store and things like that. We had a neighborhood grocery store, so we did some of our grocery shopping right around the corner at Oliver's Grocery, and we could walk to it. And then sometimes we would go to the larger grocery stores. They had a Jitney Jungle at that time. They had an A&P. Those are the two major chains that I remember. And I remember going with my grandmother a lot to the A&P. And we didn't really, you didn't really experience a lot race-wise in the grocery stores because it was full of everybody. Blacks, whites, everybody shopped at the grocery store. However, there were no black cashiers. During that time, when I was in elementary school and junior high school, a position handling money was not something that black people were hired for. And I distinctly remember being in junior high school when one of my classmates had a mother that worked at Sunflower grocery store. Sunflower was a smaller chain. I think it was a chain. I know they had one store. I think they had more than that. But she was the first black cashier hired at a grocery store in Jackson. And I was in junior high school. I remember that very well. It would seem so odd now, but that was the case at the time. But I did, getting back to Walton, our teachers were very, very concerned with us all over. I remember Miss Larry, my first grade teacher, called all of us her babies. And she was so good to all the children. She didn't really make a distinction based on what their parents did or how they dressed or what they looked like. She loved all of them. And I remember we had a program one time, and there were two little boys in our class. They were twins. I don't remember their name, but they were twins. And they didn't dress very well most days when they came to school. Often their noses would be running, or their hair might be a little unkempt. They weren't dressed very neatly. But she hugged them and called them her babies. And I do remember when we had a program one time, the twins came and they had on these starched white shirts and little bow ties and pants with suspenders. And they looked so cute. And everybody commented on how cute they looked. And they just beamed. And Miss Larry hugged them. And I just remember that. And I appreciated her so much for that. And if any of the little girls didn't have ribbons for their hair, she had ribbons that she had brought, and she'd put ribbons in the hair of any of the little girls that didn't have any ribbons. But I had good teachers all throughout elementary school. My sixth grade teacher, Benny Richard, to the best of my knowledge, is still living. He later became a principal, but he was our sixth grade teacher. And we did so many things. We did scientific experiments. I remember making the light bulb light up. And some of these things came from books that were not our book, but books from more advanced classes, older students. At Thanksgiving time, he brought sugar cane. We made a horn of plenty with vegetables. We kept an aquarium in our classroom. I remember zebrafish being in it. We had a hamster at one time, and we were responsible for feeding the hamster, and we would take the hamster out of the cage and play with it. We decided that the hamster was lonely. The hamster was named Clyde. We decided that Clyde was lonely. So we asked Mr. Richard, could we purchase another hamster? And we did. But unfortunately, they fought all the time, and we had to separate them. And that we found out that we thought the other hamster was a female, and we had called her Thelma. It turns out that she was not a female; she was another male hamster, and so they were fighting all the time, and we had to get a separate container for our second hamster. But Mr. Richard went all out to give us every possible experience that he could, and he was very dedicated, and I have appreciated him over all these years. And most of the students that I went to elementary school with grew up and became successful adults. Most went to college. Many became doctors, lawyers, accountants, administrators, all kinds of professions, and many of them I have recognized and seen from time to time, ministers. But it was, as I said, it was a pretty good time for us to grow up because we were not really aware of all of the racism that was impacting our parents and our lives in total. I do remember, though, several things. I remember when we would travel anywhere. My father died when I was 8 years old. So this had to have been before I was 8 years old. When we would travel somewhere in the car, we couldn't stop and go to the restroom. We always had to wait until we got to where we were going. We never really went too far by car that I can recall, but I do remember having to go to the restroom a time or two, and we just had to wait. I also remember having to go on the side of the road more than once. And I didn't really understand why we couldn't stop and go to the restroom at the service station or restaurant or anywhere until much later. I also remember that some of the downtown stores would not let black people try on clothes. And so when we would look for an Easter outfit, my mother made sure she only went to those stores where we could try on. And I remember her discussing with my grandmother once a store that had cute clothes, but my mother said no, we wouldn't be able to try them on there, and so we didn't go there. But I remember we had a Parisian, we had a Kennington's. A lot of people went to Parisians, and I don't remember whether or not that was one of the stores where we could try on or not at that time. Eventually we could. I also remember my grandmother talking about feeling ignored when she was in stores, and if a white person was there, they would wait on the white person before they would wait on the black person. And that bothered my grandmother a lot. I'm not sure how much that still prevailed when my mother was doing her shopping, but it is definitely something that my grandmother experienced and that bothered her. But that's a lot of what I remember about my childhood.
Do you have any particular memories about your parents that you'd like to share?
Well, like I said, my father died when I was 8, and that in and of itself was a pretty traumatic experience. He had a heart attack. I was at school at Walton, and a friend of my mother's came to pick us up early that day, and I had a bad feeling that something was wrong. I was in the 3rd grade, and my sister, Gail, would have been in the 1st grade, I believe. And then when we got home, I saw my mother was in her sitting up in her bed in her bedroom, and I could tell something was wrong. And then she told us that our father had passed. And of course, you don't really understand fully the impact of death at that age. I was sad, but it still didn't really register what all of this meant. And then I do remember a few years later, maybe by the time I was 6th grade, we were sitting in class and someone came early to pick up my friend Sherry Fleming, who lived up the street from us on Revels. And I remember thinking to myself, I hope she's not going to have news like I did. And unfortunately, that's exactly what it was. Her father had passed, and so her mother sent someone to the school to pick her up. But at that time, most of our neighborhood consisted of two-parent homes, a married husband and wife. There was one lady who was not married and had children on the street that we never really understood where their father was. And then there was another group of people across the street from us that had several young ladies and one guy and their mother and a lot of children. And we never really understood exactly whose children were whose. But later on, as I got older, I came to know whose children were whose. But at that time, they didn't have a husband in the household. There was the grandfather at one point was in the household, but he left during the time that we lived there. And so that was a female-headed household. But most of the people on the street were married couples raising their children. And of course, we had, some interesting characters. There was one lady on the far end of the street, away from my end, who was said to tell fortunes, and people would pay her, and she would tell their fortunes. Well, I take that back. She wasn't on the far end. She was close to where I lived, actually. I never, knew firsthand if that was true or not, but it was certainly rumored. And then there was a lady who lived, and her husband, who lived a few houses from us, that was reportedly a bootlegger. And I do remember seeing, and my mother would tell us, not to ever go there, and we would generally cross the other side of the street when we walked past there. I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew I kind of wanted to stay away from it. But on more than one occasion, I saw white policemen coming out of her house, talking, acting friendly, and they had little bags in their hand. And they called her a bootlegger, but I don't know that she actually made any liquor. But liquor was illegal at that time. And so, whenever they would obtain liquor from Louisiana, where it was legal, or somewhere else, and sell it, that was illegal. And so I think sometimes they were called bootleggers. People were emerging with neat little brown bags that were more than likely some kind of alcoholic beverage. I remember her name, but I won't say it. And she had a son that lived there with them, and the son wound up marrying one of the women who was at the house that had all the children that we didn't know who they belonged to. But they married and moved away, not away from the city or the state necessarily, but away from that neighborhood, our neighborhood.
Did you ever get your fortune told?
No, no. And at that time, that was considered kind of almost a cult-like thing or a witchcraft kind of thing. It was very much frowned upon by church-going people. I mean, at this time, remember, people who were in the church considered secular music, even just rock and roll or rhythm and blues or any of that, they labeled it blues, and blues was sinful. So, it was a different time where a lot of things were considered taboo, and telling fortunes was considered just like on the verge of witchcraft. It was very frowned upon.
So were the police officers, were they going to drink the alcohol, or do you think they were obtaining it?
Oh yes, I mean, they were clearly there. They left with their packages, and they were laughing and talking, so they weren't there to do any kind of law enforcement business. They were there to receive something in that little brown bag.
That's interesting. Would you like to talk about your college years?
Okay. Well, even before I went to college, I guess it was my 9th grade year of junior high school, they gave us a test, and apparently I scored very well on it, as did some other students. And so they enrolled us in this program called A Better Chance, the ABC program. And we were sent to either exclusive boarding schools or exclusive public schools out of state. I remember one of my classmates, Sherman Caldwell, that went to a very prestigious boys' school, either Andover or Exeter. I'm not recalling which. Robert Hollenshed was another of the students who went away to boarding school. And another classmate, Llewellyn was his first name. I can't remember his last name right now. And I lost touch with all of them. I don't know what happened with them. I went for 1 year. They were really more focused on getting young black males into these schools, but they gave me a scholarship for 1 year and said that they would have to see if there was going to be money to renew it. So I went to Concord Academy right outside Boston in Concord, Massachusetts for that year. And it was such a culture shock because there were only five minority students, actually. There were like three of us that were black, an Asian student, and I can't remember the other, that were on a part of the ABC program. They did have some other Asian students there whose family were paid for them to be there, but there were 5 of us from the ABC program. So the rest of the school was composed of wealthy white girls. This was a girls' boarding school. Names like Sally DuPont of the DuPont Chemical Company, Sarah Pillsbury of the Pillsbury Company. At that time, General Abrams was the highest-ranking military officer. His daughter was in our school. Caroline Kennedy came to view the campus while I was there, and they were expecting her to come the following year. I don't recall whether she ever did or not, because I only stayed the 1 year. When I got back home, there were a lot of things going on in Mississippi, a lot of changes taking place, and I had really felt very out of place at Concord and very uncomfortable, and it was difficult for me to stay there. And there were things going on at home that I wanted to be a part of, civil rights changes and student movements. And I don't even know whether I was given the scholarship for the second year, but I did not apply for the second year because I really wanted to stay in Jackson, which is what I did. So I went for my 10th grade year, my 11th grade year, I went to Concord Academy in my 10th grade year. And in my 11th grade year, I was back in public schools in Jackson. Brinkley was still a senior high school at the time, Brinkley High School on Albemarle Road. And that's where I went for 11th grade. And then, and halfway through our 11th grade year, they began to desegregate the teachers. So Brinkley was an all-black school at the time. They selected a group of teachers that they sent to the white schools in Jackson as the beginning of the desegregation process. And they took all of our best teachers and sent them to the white schools. And the teachers that we got in return, the white teachers that we got in return, were either teachers that had volunteered to come, who were willing and volunteered to come, and brand new teachers who were inexperienced and had no choice in the matter. So in some cases we got good instructors, from good white instructors. For the most part, those that wanted to come were good instructors who firmly believed in education. But the newer teachers that were new hires were generally of not good quality. And 11th grade was not the best year, and nor was 12th grade, because our 12th grade year, they desegregated the students. So they drew district lines, and if you were in a certain zone, you had to attend a certain school. And our neighborhood was zoned to go to Calloway High School. So some of us went Calloway that had gone to Brinkley. Some of us went to Murrah that had gone to Brinkley. And there were a few that went to Lanier that had formerly been at Brinkley. And to this day, even though we did not graduate from Brinkley High School, we still consider ourselves a class, all of us that were together our junior year, and we have our reunions and class functions together. Well, after high school, and there are a lot of things that happened in that year, that desegregation year. It was interesting. There was the majorette group, or the dance troupe that performed with the band, were called the Chargettes. And when we arrived, it was a line of all white young ladies, and they wore their hair in a ponytail that came down one side and draped down their front. And of course, some of them would have a wig or, extension or whatever it was to make that ponytail long. But when we arrived, every office, every extracurricular position that had any meaning, every student government position, all of these things had already been decided the year before. So we were locked out of participating in any of these things. So those of us who might have been student council president could not even be on the student council. But as a friend of mine pointed out, they didn't lock out any football players. They let our football players play on their team, which helped them out immensely. But that became a source of a lot of tension and a lot of unrest among the black students. And eventually, at one point, we had a walkout. I was one of the organizers of the walkout. We just spread the word by mouth to everyone of the time that we were going to walk out of the building and go outside, leave class. We called the radio stations and television stations ahead of time to tell them what we were going to do. And sure enough, some of them showed up. And so we did our protest. We walked out, just stood around outside, talked to the media, explained what our grievances were, how we were not allowed to participate in anything. We were locked out of these positions because they had decided everything the year before, and they made no exceptions, because we were coming. And as a result of that, and some meetings and some discussions, eventually they made a few concessions. The first thing they did, the cheerleaders had been selected the year before. And since we weren't allowed to be cheerleaders, early on, they had said, well, we'll create a pep squad, and people could try out for the pep squad. Well, as it turned out, only the black students tried out for the pep squad. And so the pep squad, who sat in the stands, was all black, and the cheerleaders were still all white. So that still was not acceptable. But after the walkout, they did decide they would open up cheerleader tryouts for 2 additional slots. And one of the reasons they did this was because there was a young white student who had come from a different city, I believe, or from private school, wherever she came from. She had not been at Calloway the previous year, and she had been a cheerleader, and she wanted to be a cheerleader. And so she was also locked out. So they were much more agreeable to open up, to reopen the cheerleader tryouts, because they had a white student who also wanted to try out and be on the cheerleaders. So sure enough, we wound up with one black student who made the team, and the other was a white student who made the team. So the 2 slots definitely did not go to the 2 black students, as we figured that the white student would probably get one of those slots. And the style of cheerleading for the white students was very different from the style of cheerleading that we had at the black schools. So those who were interested in trying out, we had a white student who was a cheerleader. We approached her about working with some of the black students to teach them some of the cheers that they did. And we were very fortunate that we had someone who did that. And that's how my friend Casey, Cassandra, made the team, was because she had had someone to kind of show her what their cheers were. However, Casey had gone to white schools for most of her life, and so she had seen the cheers done before, even though she had not done them herself. So she had a little bit of a head start, but she was the one who made the cheerleading squad. They also decided they would open up slots for the Chargettes. And we did the same thing. And we did this at my house. We had all the girls who were interested in trying out to come to my house, and we lined up in the street in front of our house. And one of the white students who was on the Chargettes came and worked with them, showing them some of the routines and how to do it. And we started off with maybe 10 girls who were interested. I can't remember how many actually tried out, but only one actually made the team. But at least that was something we could see. When they stuck their legs out, we could see one brown leg out there. So it was quite an ordeal when we got ready to have elections for things like Miss Calloway. These were, superficial, not meaningful, not government positions, but still, it was the one thing that we got to vote on. The class beauties, the things that you vote on for class day, like Mr. and Miss Calloway, class beauties, these kinds of things. So Black students met, got together, decided who we were going to support for these various things and who we were going to encourage to run for these various things. And that way, we were able to get a class beauty, and I was voted Miss Calloway. Even though Black students were only about 30% of the population, we had unified in voting. So I was able to be Miss Calloway at a time when it was still predominantly white school. And of course, that was not well received by a lot of people, but I was the first Black Miss Calloway. And I had a lot of bitter and angry feelings about the things that happened at Calloway for a very long time. I would not go back for any reason. But years later, after I had finished law school and was practicing law, they invited me to come back and speak to the class. By this time, it was an all-Black high school. And I wanted to come back and do whatever I could to motivate students, or do whatever I could at that time. So I kind of got over my very negative feelings about Calloway, because it was certainly a different school from what it had been. I went to college at Millsaps, which is a local school, had a very good reputation. And once again, I got a very good education. And I know I had a good education from the Jackson Public Schools because it had well prepared me for Millsaps College. And I was able to do well in my courses there because I had a good background, and because my mother had also, enforced a lot of things in us, and my sister and I both did a lot of reading, which helped prepare us for college. And while I was at college, the era of the big afro and the bell bottoms had come in, and I had a big fro that people told me looked like Angela Davis. And we were sort of coming into our own of understanding Blackness and Black power, and wearing dashikis and this kind of thing. So college was an interesting experience. It was Millsaps was one of the more liberal schools in Mississippi, and we had some instructors that were involved in the civil rights movement. Even though we didn't have any Black instructors that I can recall, they were all white. But it was mainly a good experience. And well, I can't really think of that much else about college that would be interesting.
Would you like to talk about becoming a parent or caretaker, supporter of children?
When I graduated from Callaway, as I said, I felt that I had had a good education all the way through my Jackson Public School experience. And even though I had a lot of negative experiences at Callaway, I still, the coursework was still good. The teachers were, for the most part, still good teachers. But my two children, they took different paths somewhat. They both started off in public school. They went to North Jackson Elementary School, and they seemed to be doing well. I liked the school. I did want them to participate in the APAC program, which was the Academic and Performing Arts Complex, which was a more advanced level of some of the core courses, and also had a performing arts component. And I just wanted my children to be exposed to as much as they could and as much of the advanced work as they could. So we had them tested and subsequently enrolled in that program. And I was a little disappointed that some of the instructors at North Jackson Elementary frowned upon children who going to the APAC program because they said that, I think they felt it was an insult, like we were saying that the students weren't being taught well at North Jackson Elementary, and that's not the case at all. If there was an opportunity to do some advanced work, some additional work, I wanted them to have it. And so I don't think all of the teachers at North Jackson did as much as they could have to make sure that was a smooth experience, because it was part of their day was at North Jackson Elementary, and then part of their day was at the APAC program at Power Elementary. And then when they finished at North Jackson, they went to a private school for a while. Actually before they finished at North Jackson, my oldest went to St. Richard for a while when it was still an elementary school. But he didn't adjust very well. He didn't like it. And by the time he was junior high, he wanted to go back to public school. And my husband and I felt that if that's what he really wanted, then that's what we needed to do, because he just didn't feel comfortable at St. Richard, where he was the only black student in his class. There were other black students in the school, but I believe he was the only one in his class, and it was not a good adjustment for him. So he went back to public school for junior high and high school. He went to Powell and to Callaway. And every year it was such a struggle to decide about schools for them, because it seemed to me that the Jackson Public Schools had deteriorated from what they had been when I was in school. And I don't know why that is, but it did seem that way at the time. My daughter, on the other hand, who was much more socially outgoing, did well and was fine in the predominantly white environment. However, by the time she started at St. Richard, at St. Joe, she didn't go to St. Richard. By the time she started at St. Joe in junior high school, there were a significant number of black students there. So she was not the only one in her class by any means, which I'm sure made her much more comfortable. There was a large population of black students there, maybe as many as 40%, maybe as many as 50%, I'm not sure. But when my son was a senior in high school at Callaway, the same school that I had graduated from, I went back for a parent-teacher conference, and I never will forget how much more elementary the work seemed to be that they were doing than what we had done when I was in school. I was just blown away at the difference. And this is the exact same school that I had attended, but looking at the examples of their work, it just seemed like it should have been on a junior high level, not on a high school level. And his math teacher was explaining to me how if they attempted to solve the problem, she gave them credit. And I didn't really, and I think she was giving them complete credit, marking it right, and I didn't understand that at all. When I was in school, and I know old people tend to say this, how things were so different, but this was true. In our math class, you had to get the correct answer, but that was only half of the problem. You also had to show by your, your scribblings, your problem, that you had arrived at the answer correctly. The teacher had to see that you had worked through that problem yourself and come to that correct answer in order for you to get the full credit. And I knew that while my son was in school, they had these study sheets. So whenever there was a test or anything coming up, the teacher would give them these study sheets, and they memorized the questions, memorized the answers that went to the questions, and that's all that he had to know. They didn't really have to understand the background of why this answer was as it was. And oftentimes I would ask my son about more in-depth information about the questions that they were studying. And he didn't ever seem to have that. He said that all they needed to know was what was on this study sheet. So it was a very different approach to education from when I grew up. And it was always a struggle every year to try and decide, because you definitely want to support public schools because that's where the majority of our students are going to be educated, in public schools. But by the same token, you want your children to get the best education they can get, and if you don't see that they're getting it, then you feel an obligation to do something different. So it was just always, I was always torn. Once they got past elementary school, I was always torn about that issue. In our neighborhood, we moved away from Virden Addition when I was 14. As I said, my father had died when I was little. My mother remarried when I was 14, and we moved to a different area. And but my mother kept the house that we had lived in and rented it out. And over the years, as we would go back to that house, as people would come and go, and we'd have to do things to repair and ready it for somebody else, or if we'd go back to see the person who lived there or what have you, I didn't get back very often, but I did get back every now and then. And there were still some people that we knew that still lived on the street also. But the neighborhood changed so much over time. When I was there, like I said, there were working people, married couples, but over time there were fewer and fewer working people, more and more women that were on public assistance, more and more men that were not working, more and more people addicted to drugs. When crack became a problem, it just devastated our communities. So many of the young men you would hear were addicted. Some of them died. Some of them did things for drugs that caused them to go to prison. The houses deteriorated. Some of them were left empty and boarded up. And I don't think any of that would have been that way if it had not been for the crack problem that just swept through and devastated our community.
Would you like to talk about your work life, work experiences, what that was like?
Okay. I had always known I wanted to be a lawyer. I don't know why exactly. There weren't lawyers in my family when I was little. I didn't see very many black lawyers when I was young. I knew of a couple of black lawyers, but I didn't really know much about them. But just from watching television, it seemed like lawyers made a difference. And that's what I wanted to do. So I was one of those people that, went to law school thinking they could change the world. And I didn't go right away. After college, I married, I had a family, but I knew I wanted to go to law school, so I did go a few years later. And that was an interesting experience. I enjoyed the coursework for law school. I found it interesting, so it wasn't that difficult to make myself do the reading that was required because the cases were usually very interesting. But I still faced my share of discrimination. In one class, my second year, I had a professor who was not very proficient in English or in writing or in grammar or in vocabulary. It was evident from things he said in class. He misunderstood what some words meant. But this was a person who was going to be grading my paper. And I was one of the better students in the class. And my paper, I knew the material back and forth, and I was fully expecting to get an A. And I didn't get an A. I got a B minus, which I know that's not a really bad grade, but it's not what I deserved. And I remember when I went to talk to him afterwards, trying to understand why the grade was as it was, and if there was any way to do anything about it. And the first thing he asked me was, where did I go to school? He said, did you go to Jackson State? And he said, sometimes, if you can't write that well. And I was just flabbergasted. First of all, he's insulting Jackson State by saying someone who went to Jackson State is likely not to be that good a writer. However, I did not even go to Jackson State anyway. I went to Millsaps. So he was making two incorrect assumptions there. And then for him to say that perhaps I was not a good writer when I knew he couldn't even use grammar correctly. He didn't understand the difference between tactic and tacit. When asked about it one day in class, he constantly misstated things that were different from the way they were in the book. But this man had the nerve to question whether I could write, and writing had always been my strong suit. No one had ever told me my writing was not good. So, this was this man making certain assumptions and giving me this grade that was below what I deserved. But there was really nothing you could do about it. So I had to take my B minus and keep on. I had another professor who gave me what I felt was 2 letter grades below what I deserved. And he gave me the lowest grade I had in law school. And I had to have him for 2 semesters. He gave me the same thing twice. And from what I understand, for years and years, before me and after me, every black student that he ever taught, he gave a lower grade than what they deserved. One student who had all A's, he did not give an A to. This young lady had an A in everything else, and he gave her a B, which is still a decent grade, but not what I'm sure she deserved. Just like he gave me less than a B, and I knew more about this subject than he did. But every outstanding, I'll say, black student, every black student who otherwise had good grades or was accomplished somehow in the law school, he gave them their worst grade. He gave another young lady who was an outstanding student, who later became a United States attorney, a very bright young lady, he actually gave her a D. And there is no way she deserved a D. I was a teaching assistant for writing when she came through, and she took that course, and she did a wonderful job on her paper. So there's just no way she would have deserved a D. And I found out from other people who had taught or worked at the law school after I left that this was his pattern with black students. Also, I became the editor-in-chief of the Law Review my senior year. I was on Law Review, and the current editors apparently thought I wrote the best paper, and so they selected me. The students were allowed to make the selection. They selected me to be the editor-in-chief for the upcoming year. It's a lot of work. Being the editor-in-chief or the managing editor takes a lot of time that you're not getting paid for. So the previous year, some alumni had said that they were going to create a scholarship for the editor-in-chief and the managing editor of the Law Review for the following year, which would have been the year that I became editor-in-chief. But when I was named editor-in-chief, that scholarship suddenly disappeared. I remember inquiring about it with the dean, and he just said, well, it fell through. However, there were some younger alumni led by Scott Levenway, who was, so these were the young alumni that were in their 30s or so. They got together and created a scholarship fund for us. It wasn't as much as the original one was going to be $1,500, and this one was $1,000. That doesn't sound like much now, but it was a lot more at that time. So I was very grateful to that group of young alumni. These were alumni strictly of the law school that did this. The first alumnus person that said he was going to pay for that he was going to start a scholarship fund was a graduate of the undergraduate Mississippi College Law School. I don't know if he was a graduate of law school or not, but he was a member of the undergraduate Mississippi College Alumni Association. So I was always very grateful to the attorneys that did come up with the scholarship. Also, I had a professor who used the N-word in class, in my constitutional law class. This guy was someone they dug up to teach constitutional law who had no background in it at all. He had been a Chancery Court judge in another county. They had someone lined up who was supposed to be coming to teach constitutional law from another law school that everyone was excited about, but at the last minute he didn't come. And so they went and found this other person just trying to get someone to teach the class. And this person had no background in it and was very racist. He did not know how to pronounce the word Negro to begin with, and in constitutional law there are a lot of old cases that refer to Negroes, and he pronounced it in that Southern way that a lot of old racist Southerners did, Negra. And so he kept getting closer and closer to the real word, and then one day in class he slipped and said it. I don't know if he slipped and said it or if he did it on purpose, but he said the N-word, and I sat up trying to think, did he really say what I thought he said? And as soon as I looked around at my fellow students, they were just mouths hanging open, looking frightened like deer in headlights, like they didn't know what to do, and some of them were looking at me. So they knew what he had said too. And I gathered up my belongings. You're so shocked you almost don't know what to do, but I knew I wasn't going to stay in there. So I gathered up my belongings, my papers and everything, and my books, and walked out of the class. He was still up there talking, and I just walked out of the class. And I had some white students that I had considered friends, and I wondered if they were going to walk out, leave with me. But they didn't, except one person who was not someone that I had considered a close friend, but someone that I had studied with occasionally. Debbie Jarrett was her name. Well, Debbie Martin at the time. She later married and became Debbie Jarrett. I always remembered her for this. She followed me out of the classroom, and she had tears in her eyes, and she was apologizing for what he had said. And of course, it wasn't her place to apologize for him. She hadn't said anything. But I appreciated her for supporting me in that way. So I went straight to the dean's office to talk about it, but he was like, well, we don't have anybody else to teach that. We don't have a choice, and that's probably not what he said. You know how some people say Negra, and that's probably what he said, but no, that's not what he said this time. That's what he had been saying for weeks, but not today. So I insisted on being able to withdraw from the class without being penalized for it and getting my money back, even though it was past time when you're supposed to be able to get your money back, because I was determined I wasn't going to take it from him. So they did do that, but that wasn't much concession. And ultimately, I was able to take constitutional law under a different professor, but it did handicap me a little bit because that's a course that you need to have early on, and I was only able to take it my third year because I refused to take it under that particular professor. But after law school, I had some pretty good opportunities. I first worked for a legislative committee in the state legislature. And then from there, I went with the Attorney General's office, where I worked in the Consumer Protection Division. And Bill Lane was the Attorney General at the time. And he was running for governor during the time that I was there, and he won that election. And he hired me on his staff to be legal counsel. And I was the first black legal counsel for a governor. And that was an interesting experience. It had some ups and some downs. But I stayed as long as I felt I was able to do some good and make some difference, even though it was difficult for me being there a lot of the time. After that, the new governor, the incoming governor, appointed me to be the chairman of the Mississippi Parole Board. So I was the first black chairman of the parole board for the state of Mississippi. And I ran that agency and advocated for a full-time, this was the board members were part-time except for the chairman. I was the only full-time employee, and the others were part-time. And then, of course, we had full-time staff, but the other board members were part-time. But there were too many prisoners now for us to really give them adequate consideration. So I advocated that we get a full-time board of people that were dedicated to the job 40 hours a week. And with a lot of hard work, a lot of testifying before committees of the legislature, we got that passed. And the governor was also very much behind it as well. And when I was on the governor's staff, before I was appointed to the parole board, I worked, one of the areas that I had responsibility for was corrections. And so that's kind of how I was selected to be the chairman of the parole board. But during that time, we proposed and pushed for legislation that created additional earned time credits for the inmates, meritorious earned time, so that they could get more credit off of their sentence and complete their sentences sooner based on actual accomplishments that they had. And some version of that law is still in effect today. I also practiced law for a time, but after a while I left the legal profession for quite a few years and did other things, artsy things as I call them. Owned a little gallery for a while, was a gallery director for a while, and then I returned to law. And even though I'm considering retiring soon, I am back in the legal profession again.
Can you talk about what it was like being in law and then going back to law?
Practicing law can be very, very demanding and very, very challenging and very, very stressful. A lot of lawyers that I know wish they could think of something else to do. There are some good things about it, though. It was not dull. It was interesting. But the constant press of deadlines, it depends, of course, on what kind of law you're involved with. But the constant press of deadlines, the feeling of being responsible for somebody's life or well-being or financial well-being or whatever, can take a real toll. And so there were a lot of reasons that went into my leaving the profession, including health reasons, personal reasons. And I really felt at the time that I did not want to practice law anymore. And I felt that way for quite a few years. But eventually I began to miss the intellectual challenge, and I had told myself I was going to get back into some kind of professional life, law, something law related or something else. And so I started taking steps to do that, and I'm glad I did. I'm very glad I did. I have enjoyed what I've done these past few years.
In what ways do you think that sharing your own stories will benefit your children and the children for generations to come?
Well, I think it's important for my children who are adults now and the children who are coming along who are still young children now. I think it's important for them to know what has transpired in the past. And I wish people who are familiar with Virden Addition as it is now could have seen it when I was a child. People kept their homes painted, their yards done nicely. They planted flowers. Like I said, children played in the street. People generally didn't lock their doors except at night. All day long, the door was generally kept open so that children could come and go. You didn't really have fear like you do now. Now at night, especially since my mother was a single mother, after my father died, the door was locked. I'm not sure that it was always locked when my father was still living, but at night. But it was definitely left open during the day, and we just came and went. And you could open your door to people back then. There were people that would come around selling eggs, selling vegetables, playing instruments. And you would go to the door, and you might not open the screen right away until you knew who they were, but you didn't have any hesitancy about opening up the door to see who it was. And you would buy eggs, buy vegetables, buy whatever it was. And I remember one time a man was playing an accordion. He came to the door, and I remember I was very little, and I remember looking at the accordion, wondering what it was and what it would sound like. And I didn't really understand why he was there, but I was hoping my mother would let him in, and she did. And he began playing the accordion, and all the neighbors from around came to our house and gathered in the living room or on the front porch if they couldn't get quite in the house to listen to him play the accordion. And then they gave him a little change, a little money. And he was probably a transient, and this is what he was doing to make money. But I remember I was just fascinated. Now, you wouldn't do that today, but we did it back then. I remember somebody coming who played the guitar one time, too. So it was just so different and such a nicer place to grow up. And now it's just totally different.
Well, thank you for this interview. It was nice talking to you.
Thank you. You're welcome.